I suppose I should start with the sound. That's what stayed with me longest, what I hear even now in the silence between heartbeats. Not the screams, those came later. And they were mine, but the sound the Grav-Gun made when it cycled up. A low hum that built to a whine, then collapsed into itself like a lung deflating. Whomp, whomp, whomp. Rhythmic as a pulse, except it was killing pulses, stopping them, reversing them, turning blood into something that moved in directions blood shouldn't move. The testing facility on Mordax Tertius wasn't supposed to be a crucible. The recruitment sergeant who'd plucked me from the PDF reserves had made it sound almost routine. Weapon trials, he'd said, his augmetic eye whirring as it scanned my service record. Imperial Guard needs volunteers for equipment assessment. 3 months. Better rations than frontline. Safer too. He'd smiled when he said that last part, and I'd believed him because I wanted to believe him. Because I'd already seen enough of the front line on Genna IV, where the orcs had overrun our positions, and I'd spent 2 days hiding in a corpse pile, while my sergeant's blood slowly dried sticky against my face. So I'd volunteered. Signed the data slate with a thumbprint that left a smudge of fingerprint oil on the screen. They shipped me out within the week, crammed into a transport hold with 43 other soldiers, all of us clutching our acceptance notices like they were pilgrimage tokens. Most of them were younger than me, fresh-faced kids who'd never seen real combat, who thought weapon trials meant firing range work and performance bonuses. I knew better, but I told myself knowing better meant I'd be prepared. That experience was armor. The facility itself squatted in Mordax Tertius's northern wastes like a fungal growth, all ferrocrete and corrugated plasteel, ringed by defense towers that tracked our transport with weapons I couldn't identify. The planet was listed as a Forge World subsidiary in the manifest, but the landscape looked bombed out, cratered. Later, I learned it had been 4 centuries ago the Mechanicus had strip-mined it to skeletal remains, then abandoned it when the veins ran dry. Now it served as a testing ground for weapons too experimental or too dangerous to trial near population centers. The kind of weapons you couldn't test on servitors because servitors didn't scream right. They processed us in batches, stripped us of rank insignia and personal effects, issued grey coveralls marked only with identification numbers stenciled across the back. Mine was 8,847. I remember watching them catalogue my possessions, 1 Imperial infantryman's handbook, well thumbed, 1 set of dog tags, 1 pocket icon of the Emperor, cheap pressed tin, 1 photograph of my sister before the plague took her. The clerk, a hunched woman with finger augments that clicked when she moved, didn't look at any of it, just scanned, catalogued, stored. "You'll get it back," she said in a tone that suggested she'd said it 10,000 times and believed it less with each repetition. The dormitory blocks were converted storage units, 50 bunks to a unit, arranged in double stacks with barely enough space between them to turn around. The air tasted of recycled sweat and disinfectant. Above each bunk, someone had stenciled a number. I found 8,847 inches the back corner, the mattress worn to the shape of whoever had slept there before me. There were scratches in the metal frame, names, maybe, or prayers. They'd been filed away, leaving only grooves that caught your fingernail if you ran your hand across them. That first week they ran us through medical evaluations, not the cursory kind you get during guard intake, but deep tissue scans, bone density analysis, cognitive function tests that left you with headaches that lasted hours. They were looking for something specific, though they never told us what. Men and women disappeared from the dormitory every night, their bunks stripped and reassigned by morning. No explanation, no acknowledgement. The woman in the bunk next to mine, a lean scout from a Talan regiment with a face like weathered leather, vanished on the 4th night. When I woke the next morning, her mattress was already occupied by a pale kid who couldn't have been more than 19, shaking so badly his teeth chattered. "Where do they go?" I asked the others during the morning meal. Reconstituted protein paste that tasted of nothing, served in bowls stamped with the Mechanicus cog. Nobody answered. They ate in silence, eyes on their bowls, and I learned my first real lesson about the facility. We didn't ask questions. Questions were noticed. Being noticed was dangerous. But I couldn't stop noticing things, the way the guards, all PDF veterans like me, but wearing crimson armbands that marked them as facility security, kept their hands near their sidearms whenever they escorted us between buildings. The way certain corridors were off limits, marked with hazard sigils that I'd never seen in any Imperial manual. The way the Medicae staff wore full biocontainment suits, even though we'd all been screened for contagions during intake processing. The way the facility's Vox speakers played hymns during the night hours, static-laced prayers that seemed designed to prevent sleep rather than encourage it. And I noticed the Grav-Gun. They showed it to us on the 8th day, assembled us in a demonstration amphitheater carved into the facility's sublevels. The air down there was colder, damp in a way that suggested we were below the water table, though Mordax Tertius was supposed to be desert dry. We sat on steel benches while a Mechanicus tech priest, robes oil-stained, mechadendrites writhing with their own nervous energy, stood before us beside a weapon mounted on a transit cart. It looked wrong. Most Imperial weapons have a certain aesthetic, brutal, yes, but comprehensible. Las rifles, bolt weapons, even plasma guns, follow a logic you can trace. Trigger, barrel, power source. The Grav-Gun didn't follow that logic. Its housing was bulbous, asymmetrical, covered in cooling veins that looked like they belonged on a starship engine. The barrel, if you could call it that, was wide-mouthed, ringed with what might have been focusing elements or might have been decorative scarification. Cables ran from the weapon's housing to a backpack power unit that hummed with barely contained energy. The whole assembly looked less like a weapon and more like a surgical instrument scaled up to military proportions. The Graviton compression rifle, the tech priest announced, his voice filtered through a Vox unit that stripped it of humanity, represents the Omnissiah's will made manifest in the form of gravitic manipulation. He gestured with one mechadendrite, and the weapon's power unit thrummed louder. Standard projectile and energy weapons damage through penetration or thermal transfer. This weapon operates on a different principle. It generates a localized gravitational anomaly, crushing the target from within while leaving external armor intact. He let that sink in. Around me I felt the other volunteers shifting, uncomfortable. Someone 3 rows back made a noise that might have been a question or might have been a protest, but the guards' hands moved to their sidearms and the noise stopped. "Observe," the tech priest said, and gestured toward a side door I hadn't noticed. 2 servitors wheeled in a combat dummy, the full-body kind used for ballistic testing, wearing carapace armor identical to what I'd worn on Genna IV. They positioned it 10 meters from the Grav-Gun, then retreated with that peculiar servitor gait that suggested their legs didn't quite remember how human locomotion worked. The tech priest adjusted something on the weapon's housing. The hum changed pitch, rising. "Standard graviton pulse," he said. 40% output capacity. He triggered the weapon. Whump. The sound was wrong in a way I can't adequately describe. It wasn't loud, quieter than a lasgun discharge, but it resonated in your chest, in your teeth, in the fluid of your inner ear. The air between the weapon and the dummy seemed to ripple, to compress, and the dummy jerked backward as if struck. But there was no visible projectile, no beam, no plasma bloom, just that ripple. And the dummy reacting. "Exterior damage minimal," the tech priest announced. 2 servitors approached the dummy and began removing its armor plates. The carapace came off in sections, apparently intact, until they exposed what lay beneath a transparent gel torso designed to simulate human tissue density. It had ruptured. Not exploded, but ruptured. The gel squeezed out through rupture points in an irregular pattern, as if something had grabbed the dummy's insides and crushed them like a man crushing overripe fruit in his fist. "Internal organs experience catastrophic compression trauma," the tech priest continued. "Soft tissues liquefy. Bones fracture under the gravitational stress. The target's armor, designed to prevent penetration, becomes a prison that contains the destruction." He paused, mechadendrites coiling and uncoiling. Death is effectively instantaneous for unaugmented human targets. I'd seen men die. I'd seen them torn apart by orc choppers, burned by flamer wash, cut in half by heavy bolter fire. But there was something about the dummy's interior, the way the gel had been crushed into irregular shapes, forced out through gaps that shouldn't exist, that made my hands go cold. Volunteers will undergo 3 phases of testing, the tech priest said, ignoring our discomfort, or perhaps feeding on it. Phase 1. Equipment familiarization and basic operation. Phase 2. Field trials against simulated targets. Phase 3. He paused, and even through the Vox distortion I caught something that might have been anticipation. Phase 3 parameters will be disclosed to qualified candidates. That night, the pale kid in the bunk next to mine asked me what I thought qualified meant. I told him I didn't know, which was true. But I was starting to develop theories, and none of them were theories. I wanted to speak aloud in a room where the walls were thin, and the guards walked patrol routes that seemed designed to pass by our bunks at irregular intervals, keeping us always uncertain whether we were being listened to. Phase 1 began the next day. They divided us into squads of 5, assigned each squad a Grav-Gun and a tech priest overseer. Ours was designated Magos Krell 7, though I never learned if the 7 indicated a designation or if there had been 6 predecessors. He was less augmented than the demonstration priest, still retained human eyes behind his optic augments, which somehow made him worse. You could see him watching us, evaluating us, and knowing that somewhere behind the augments and the implants was something that had once been human, but had deliberately chosen to excise that humanity piece by piece. We spent the first week learning to assemble and disassemble the weapon. The Grav-Gun broke down into 17 primary components, each one heavy enough that lifting them was a workout. The power pack alone weighed 20 kilograms, and that was before you loaded it with the gravitic cells that actually made the weapon function. Krell 7 taught us the proper rituals, prayers to be recited while connecting the power feeds, anointing oils to be applied to the gravitic focusing rings, percussive maintenance protocols that looked like hitting the housing with a sanctified wrench, but which apparently served some deeper purpose in appeasing the weapon's machine spirit. The graviton rifle is temperamental, Krell 7 told us, his mechadendrites assembling and disassembling a weapon housing with casual precision while we fumbled with bolts and clamps. It requires understanding, not merely operation. The gravitic fields it generates exist in a delicate balance. Too much power, and the field collapses prematurely. Too little, and the effect is insufficient. He held up one of the gravitic cells, a cylinder filled with what looked like metallic mercury suspended in permanent motion. These cells contain graviton particles harvested from stellar collapse events. Essentially, we have captured the crushing force of a dying star and condensed it into a form suitable for handheld deployment. The kid next to me, I'd learned his name was Jans, from some forgettable agri-world, asked the question I was thinking. Is it safe? Krell 7's remaining human eye fixed on Jans with something that might have been amusement. Safe is a relative term, guardsman. Safe for you? That depends on whether you follow protocols. Safe for your enemies? The mechadendrites made a clicking sound that might have been laughter. Definitely not. We practiced on static targets first. Ferrocrete blocks, ballistic dummies, decommissioned vehicles. The Grav-Gun required a different shooting stance than standard Imperial weapons. You braced it against your hip rather than your shoulder, used both hands on the forward grip to control the recoil that wasn't really recoil but was instead a sort of gravitic feedback that tried to twist the weapon in your grip. The first time I fired it, the sensation made me gag. That whump 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 pulse. And through the grips, you could feel the gravitational anomaly forming. A sick twist in your gut, like motion sickness, like your insides recognized that physics was doing something it shouldn't and wanted desperately to be somewhere else. The ferrocrete block I'd aimed at didn't explode. It compressed. One moment it was a meter-square cube. The next it had collapsed into an irregular lump roughly the size of my fist, spider-webbed with fracture lines. The molecular bonds holding the concrete together had simply given up under the gravitational stress. Adequate, Krell 7 said, marking something on a data slate. Again, We trained 8 hours daily. Assembly, disassembly, fire discipline, power management. The Grav-Gun consumed energy voraciously. Each power pack held enough charge for 20 shots before it needed to be swapped out, and swapping them required a 15-second procedure during which you were completely vulnerable. We practiced the swap until we could do it in 12 seconds, then 10, then 8. We practiced firing in sequence, staggering our shots so the squad maintained continuous fire capability. We practiced target prioritization drills, identifying which enemies would be most vulnerable to gravitic compression. And slowly, without quite noticing when it happened, we stopped being volunteers and became operators. The distinction mattered. Volunteers could quit. Operators were assets, investments, tools that had been honed to a specific purpose. When one of our squad, a woman named Teres, who'd served as a heavy weapons specialist before volunteering, requested transfer back to her regiment, citing medical concerns about the gravitational feedback, Krell 7 simply marked something on his data slate, and the next morning, Teres's bunk was empty, her equipment already redistributed. Nobody asked where she'd gone. By week 3, we'd graduated to moving targets. They used servitors for this, combat models that had been modified to wear flak armor and carry deactivated weapons. They lurched across the training range in pre-programmed patterns while we tracked them through the Grav-Gun's optical sight, a crude affair that marked targets with a red reticle that pulsed in time with the weapon's charge cycle. The first time I hit a moving servitor, the effect was worse than with static targets. The servitor didn't just stop, it crumpled, armor plates buckling inward, and something wet sprayed out through the gaps in its chest plating. I told myself it was just hydraulic fluid, just the servitor's mechanical systems rupturing, but it was the wrong color and the wrong consistency. And when the cleanup crew came to drag the wreckage away, they wore full bio-containment suits. Jans threw up after that session. We were back in the dormitory, and he just suddenly doubled over and vomited into the reclamation sink, heaving until there was nothing left but bile. I stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. The others pretended not to notice. That was another thing we'd learned. Pretending not to notice was a survival skill. "It's people," Jan said when he finally stopped heaving. His voice was ragged, throat raw. "The servitors. There used to be people. They're criminals," I said, reciting the official line. "Heretics and traitors, serving the Imperium in death as they failed to serve it in life. But we're—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. "We're practicing killing them. We're learning to crush them from the inside, while their armor keeps them intact on the outside. Learning to turn human bodies into bags of pulped meat and shattered bone." I wanted to tell him it would get easier. That you could learn to separate the servitor from the person it had been, learn to see it as just another target, just another training dummy that happened to bleed. But I'd been a soldier long enough to know that was a lie, and that the thing that actually happened was that you learned to stop caring whether it got easier or not. You just did it because that was what you did. And eventually, the part of you that asked whether you should do it went quiet, and you told yourself that was the same thing as making peace with it. Phase 2 began the following week. They transported us to a different section of the facility, deeper underground, where the walls wept condensation and the air had a mineral taste that clung to the back of your throat. The training areas here were more elaborate mock urban environments built from prefab structures, maze-like corridor complexes, multi-level kill houses where targets could appear from any angle. We practiced room clearing with the Grav-Guns, learned to account for the weapon's area of effect in close quarters. The graviton pulse didn't travel in a straight line like a lasgun beam. It propagated outward in a cone, meaning you could hit multiple targets with a single shot if they were clustered together. We practiced hitting those clusters, learned to identify which groupings would maximize casualties, learned to think in terms of gravitational geometry rather than simple targeting. And they started varying the targets. Not just servitors now, but combat dummies wearing different armor configurations. Flak armor, carapace, even power armor. We learned that the Grav-Gun's effectiveness varied inversely, with armor-quality flak-armored targets practically liquefied. Carapace-armored ones took 2 shots. Power armor could sometimes withstand 3 before the gravitic stress found a weak point and turned the occupant into paste. We learned to target joints and seals, places where armor sections met, where the gravitic pulse could penetrate more easily. We learned that a near miss was sometimes more effective than a direct hit, that the gravitational stress field created by a shot that passed close to a target could cause organ damage even through armor, a kind of gravitic shockwave that left targets bleeding from their eyes and ears. Krell 7 was pleased with our progress. He told us so repeatedly, his Vox-filtered voice carrying what might have been pride if machines could feel pride. "You are becoming efficient instruments of the Emperor's will," he said during one debriefing. "The graviton rifle requires operators of exceptional capability. You are proving yourselves worthy of that distinction." I should have felt proud, should have felt honored. Instead, I felt hollow, scraped out, as if something inside me had been compressed and crushed, just like the targets we practiced on. And in the dormitory at night, I would lie awake, listening to the hymns crackling through the Vox speakers, prayers to the Emperor, to the Omnissiah, to the machine spirits that supposedly animated our weapons, and wonder when exactly I'd stopped feeling like a soldier and started feeling like a servitor that hadn't been augmented yet. The breakthrough came during week 7. We were running a live fire exercise in the multi-level kill house, working through a scenario that involved clearing a fortified position against numerically superior enemies. The scenario was rigged. We all knew it, designed to be barely possible so they could evaluate how we performed under extreme pressure. Our squad was 3 operators down to equipment malfunctions and stress injuries, leaving just me and Jans to cover a 6-story structure filled with servitor targets programmed for aggressive defense. We'd cleared the first 4 floors without incident, moving room by room, Jans covering high angles while I swept low, both of us rotating through our power packs with practiced efficiency. But the 5th floor was different. The servitors there weren't using predictable patterns. They were taking cover, returning fire with blanks that wouldn't hurt us, but triggered the training harness sensors we wore, registering hits. Within 2 minutes my harness was flashing amber, indicating I'd taken enough damage to be combat ineffective. Jans had taken a simulated headshot and was technically Ki. But we didn't stop. Something in me refused to stop, refused to accept failure, even in a training scenario that didn't matter, that was just numbers on Krell 7's data slate. I pushed forward, Grav-Gun braced against my hip, the weapon's hum building to that awful whine and collapse rhythm. Whump, 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 whump. 3 servitors down, their torsos collapsed, armor buckling, another coming around a corner, and I fired without sighting, just muscle memory and spatial awareness, and caught it center mass. It crumpled mid-step, momentum carrying it forward in a sliding heap of compacted metal and meat. And then I was through, into the command room, the scenario designated as the objective, and there was someone there who wasn't a servitor. A man, thin, wearing a Medicae smock, hands up in surrender or prayer, or both. For a half-second I thought he was a simulation, another training dummy, but his eyes were wrong. Too focused, too aware. He was looking at me not like someone playing a role, but like someone who knew exactly what the weapon in my hands could do and was terrified of it. "Wait," he said. Just one word, but it carried all the desperation a human voice could hold. I fired. Later they told me it had been a test, that the man had been a criminal, a murderer 3 times convicted, scheduled for servitor conversion anyway. That by completing the objective despite his presence, I'd demonstrated the resolve necessary for Phase 3 qualification. That I'd done exactly what I was supposed to do. But in that moment, in the half-second between his weight and my trigger pull, I knew the truth. The test wasn't whether I could recognize a legitimate target from an illegitimate one. The test was whether I would care. The sound the Grav-Gun made when it hit him was the same sound it made hitting servitors. Whump. The gravitational anomaly propagated. His Medicae smock pressed flat against his body as if vacuum-sealed, and then he folded inward like a paper crane crumpled in a fist. His chest compressed, ribs visible through the fabric as they bent inward, and he made a sound, not a scream, because there wasn't air for that, but a high wheeze, a biological emergency broadcast that lasted maybe 2 seconds before his lungs couldn't function anymore. He stayed standing for a moment, anatomically impossible, held upright by whatever gravitic stress still lingered in his cells. Then he fell. Not like a person falls, but like a weighted sack. All his internal structure compromised, nothing left inside to maintain shape. The simulation ended, lights came up. Krell 7 emerged from an observation room I hadn't known existed, his mechadendrites making approving clicking sounds. "Excellent," he said. "Response time, 0.4 seconds. No hesitation. No deviation from tactical protocol." He made a notation on his data slate. "Guardsman 8847. You are approved for Phase 3 advancement." I stood there, Grav-Gun still braced against my hip, looking at the body that wasn't quite a body anymore, and said nothing. Behind me, Jans was making a sound, a high keening sound that might have been crying, or might have been laughing, or might have been something the human voice doesn't have a name for. They sedated him. 2 guards appeared, administered an injector, dragged Jans away while his eyes rolled back in his head, and his limbs went slack. I never saw him again. His bunk was reassigned by morning. Phase 3. They told us about it in the briefing amphitheater, the same place we'd first seen the Grav-Gun demonstrated. There were fewer of us now, maybe 20 operators out of the original 43. The rest had washed out, broken down, been reassigned to Emperor knows where. Those of us who remained sat on the steel benches, and I noticed we didn't sit together anymore. We kept distance, as if afraid proximity might reveal something we'd all agreed not to see in ourselves. A new tech priest presided, one I hadn't seen before. He was more heavily augmented than Krell 7, his lower body replaced entirely with a tracked mobility platform, his arms, a forest of mechadendrites that moved with independent purpose. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a vox grill mounted in his chest rather than anything resembling a mouth. "Phase 3, he announced, represents the culmination of your training cycle. You will deploy to an active combat zone and engage enemy forces under live battlefield conditions. Your performance will determine whether the graviton compression rifle receives approval for wider deployment across Astra Militarum forces." A pause. Around me I felt the other operators processing this. Combat zone, active, live battlefield conditions. These were words that meant something different from what they meant in the training facility. "Your target," the priest continued, "is a rebel stronghold on Mordax Tertius's southern continent. Local forces have resisted Imperial compliance for 17 months. Standard military assets have proven insufficient to reduce their position due to the fortified nature of their defensive emplacements. The graviton rifle's armor penetration characteristics make it ideal for this scenario." He gestured, and a hololith flickered to life above his mobility platform, a tactical map showing terrain I didn't recognize, marked with enemy positions, approach vectors, firing solutions. You will deploy in 4 or 5 operator squads. Each squad will assault a designated strongpoint. Your objective is complete elimination of enemy combatants within your sector. There will be no prisoners, no quarter, no negotiation. This is a weapons test, not a military engagement. We are evaluating the graviton rifle's performance, not securing territory. Another pause. Someone 3 rows back I didn't turn to see, who asked the question we were all thinking. "What about civilians?" The priest's mechadendrites stilled. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the hololith projector and the ambient drone of the facility's ventilation system. Then, there are no civilians in the target zone. All residents of the rebel stronghold are, by definition, traitors to the Imperium. Your rules of engagement are unrestricted. Any target carrying weapons or appearing to present a threat is authorized for immediate termination. Any target attempting to flee the stronghold is authorized for immediate termination. Any target attempting to surrender is authorized for immediate termination. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that it took a moment to understand what he'd actually said. No civilians, no prisoners, no surrender, just targets and graviton pulses and the wet sound of compressed organs rupturing inside armor that couldn't protect them. "You deploy at 0400 tomorrow," the priest said. "Report to your squad assembly points for final equipment issue and tactical briefing." Dismissed. We filed out in silence. I should have felt something, fear, maybe, or revulsion, or the kind of grim determination soldiers feel before combat. But I felt nothing, and that was worse than any emotion I could name. I'd become exactly what Krell 7 said I'd become: an efficient instrument, a tool. The part of me that would have objected, that would have asked questions about rules of engagement and civilian casualties and what exactly makes someone a rebel worth killing, that part had gone quiet weeks ago. Maybe it had died in the 5th floor command room when I'd looked at a terrified man and fired anyway. Maybe it had died earlier, in small increments, crushed a little more each time I pulled the trigger and felt the gravitational feedback twist through the weapon's grips. They issued us combat gear that night. Real armor this time, not training harnesses, carapace plates, with the graviton rifle operator's designation stenciled across the chest in high Gothic script I couldn't read. Helmets with integrated vox beads and optical augments. Load-bearing harnesses designed to carry 6 power packs plus backup gravitic cells. Combat knives, sidearms, frag grenades, all the standard Imperial guard kit modified to interface with our primary role as graviton rifle operators. I stood in the armory, surrounded by the other operators, all of us silently donning equipment that fit too well, that had been manufactured specifically for this deployment, and realized we'd been training for this specific mission all along. The facility, the weapons trials, the months of conditioning, it had all been preparation for this. The rebels on the southern continent weren't the test. We were. They were just the medium through which our lethality would be measured. The transport inserted us at 0400 as scheduled. 6 hours in a Valkyrie's troop hold, the Grav-Guns wait across my lap, its hum a constant presence even when powered down. We didn't talk. The 4 other operators in my squad, I knew their faces but not their names, had trained alongside them, but never learned who they'd been before. The facility sat in their crash harnesses, eyes closed or staring at nothing, and I wondered if they felt as hollowed out as I did. The pilot's voice crackled over the vox. "LZ, in 30 seconds. Enemy contact likely. Emperor protects. Emperor protects." I'd heard that phrase 10,000 times, recited it myself during morning prayers and evening devotionals, but suddenly it seemed like a question rather than a declaration. Protects whom? The righteous? The loyal? Or just the ones who survived long enough to tell themselves they deserved protection? The Valkyrie's rear ramp dropped, and we were moving, stumbling out into pre-dawn darkness, the Grav-Gun's weight throwing off my balance until muscle memory adjusted. The landing zone was a cleared patch of scrubland, vegetation burned away by the Valkyrie's engines, and beyond it I could see the rebel stronghold, a cluster of prefab structures surrounded by improvised fortifications, wire, trenches, firing positions. Lights burned in some windows. People lived there, slept there, woke there, and ate breakfast, and did all the mundane things that humans do, except they'd refused some tithe or disobeyed some compliance order, and now that made them targets. The squad leader, I still didn't know his name, gestured us into formation. We advanced on the stronghold in a loose skirmish line, Grav-Guns at the ready, the weapons hum building as we closed range. 200 meters, 100, 50. Then someone in the stronghold saw us, and everything happened very fast. Autogun fire, poorly aimed, kicking up dirt to my left. I went prone, brought the Grav-Gun's reticle up, found targets 3 figures in improvised flak armor, firing from a trench line. Whump, 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 whump. The gravitational anomaly propagated, and they crumpled, all 3 at once, armor collapsing inward as their bodies compressed. One of them screamed, a high sound that cut off abruptly when his lungs stopped functioning. More targets. Everywhere, suddenly, As the stronghold woke to our presence, people running, shouting, trying to organize a defense. Some had military weapons. Some had mining tools converted to weapons. Some had nothing but their hands. The rules of engagement said it didn't matter. Target, pulse, compress, move. That was the pattern. That was the procedure. I worked through 2 power packs in the first 5 minutes. The Grav-Gun's barrel, if it was a barrel, grew hot. The cooling vanes glowing dull red. Around me the other operators were firing, a rhythmic chorus of whomp-whomp-whomp pulses, and the stronghold's defenders were dying in ways that left their armor intact but their bodies ruined. I saw a man take a direct hit and fold in half backward. Spine compressed until his head nearly touched his heels. I saw a woman fire a lasgun at us, and then crumple as a graviton pulse caught her center mass. Her chest cavity compressed so thoroughly that her ribs erupted through her back plating. I saw a child, couldn't have been more than 12, running between buildings, and I tracked him with the reticle, and something in me said no. This is wrong. But my finger was already on the trigger, and the graviton pulse caught him mid-stride, and he compressed like a doll made of meat and bone. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The stronghold's defenders couldn't effectively return fire. The Grav-Gun's range exceeded their autoguns, and we were trained to use cover and concealment in ways that made us difficult targets. They tried to retreat, to fall back to interior positions, but the graviton pulses penetrated prefab walls easily, caught them through the barriers they thought would protect them. Some tried to surrender. They dropped weapons, raised hands, shouted words I couldn't hear over the weapon's hum. We killed them anyway. Rules of engagement, no prisoners, no negotiation. When it was over, I stood in the stronghold's central square, surrounded by bodies that looked intact from a distance but which had been reduced to bags of pulped flesh when you got close. The Grav-Gun's power pack was empty, spent, and I went through the mechanical process of replacing it. Eject the old pack, feel it still radiating heat, sock it in the new one, feel the weapon's hum resume. 20 more pulses, 20 more compressions, 20 more lives reduced to gravitational statistics. The tech priest's voice crackled over my vox bead. Sector 7 clear. Confirm kill count for performance evaluation. I looked around, tried to count, lost count, tried again. The bodies had that wrong quality that Grav-Gun casualties always had, armor more or less intact, but compressed, compacted, as if something had reached inside and crushed them like fruit. Some had bled out through gaps in their armor, thick pools of blood mixed with liquefied organ tissue. Some hadn't bled at all. The gravitational stress sealing wounds, even as it created them. In one corner, a woman lay crumpled, her carapace armor barely dented. But when I'd fired on her, I'd seen her collapse like a puppet with its strings cut, seen something wet spray from her helmet's neck seal, and now she lay there, and she looked almost peaceful, except for the wet sound her body made when the wind moved it slightly. Confirm kill count, the tech priest repeated, impatient. 47, I said. A guess. Could have been more. Could have been less. I'd stopped counting after the child. Adequate. Proceed to extraction point. We walked back to the landing zone through pre-dawn light that was starting to brighten into full morning. Behind us, the stronghold burned. Someone had thrown incendiaries into the prefabs. Standard procedure for cleansing rebel positions. Black smoke rose in a column that would be visible for kilometers. Good. Let them see. Let them know what happened to traitors, to rebels, to anyone who resisted the Imperium's compliance. The Valkyrie retrieved us, and we flew back to the facility in silence. I sat in my crash harness, the Grav-Gun across my lap still radiating residual heat, and stared at nothing. The other operators sat similarly silent, similarly still, and I wondered if they were thinking about the same things I was thinking about. The child running between buildings, the woman who'd tried to surrender, the man who'd folded in half backward, his spine compressed until it snapped. We were efficient instruments of the Emperor's will. We were weapons that screamed. Back at the facility they debriefed us in groups. Krell 7 was there, his mechadendrites clicking approvingly as he reviewed the tactical data. Kill ratios exceeded projections, he announced. Target saturation achieved in under 22 minutes. Graviton rifle effectiveness confirmed across all armor types and target densities. This data will form the basis of our recommendation for immediate widespread deployment. He dismissed the other operators, but gestured for me to remain. When we were alone, or as alone as you could be in a room ringed with servo skulls and recording devices, he approached, his remaining human eye studying me with something that might have been curiosity. "You have performed exceptionally throughout this evaluation cycle," he said. "Your accuracy metrics, your response times, your willingness to execute objectives without hesitation all exceed standard parameters." A pause. "We are prepared to offer you a permanent position with the Graviton Rifle Development Program, training new operators, refining deployment doctrines, serving as a subject matter expert for expanded trials." I should have felt honored, should have felt proud. Instead, I felt nothing, and that nothing was as vast and empty as vacuum, as crushing as the gravitational anomaly I'd fired 47 times that morning. "What if I refuse?" I asked. Krell 7's mechadendrites stilled. "Refuse?" He repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept, something from a language he didn't speak. "You are a volunteer. You signed the initial recruitment documentation willingly." "I volunteered for weapon trials." "Not." I gestured vaguely, trying to encompass the stronghold, the bodies, the child who'd compressed like a doll. "Not whatever this was." "This," Krell 7 said, his vox-filtered voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before, "was precisely what you volunteered for. The evaluation of experimental weapons requires field testing under combat conditions. You knew this. You participated willingly. You became proficient." "I didn't know we'd be." I stopped, because he was right. I had known. Maybe not the specifics, but the broad strokes. I'd known what weapon trials meant in the context of the Imperial Guard, what field testing required, what happens to rebels and traitors, and anyone who ends up on the wrong side of compliance orders. I'd known all of this, and I'd volunteered anyway because it was supposed to be safer than the front line, because I'd thought knowing would protect me. "What happens if I refuse your offer?" I asked again. Krell 7 considered this. His mechadendrites resumed their clicking, processing, calculating. "You would be returned to your original regiment," he said finally, "with a notation in your service record indicating psychological unsuitability for specialized weapons operations. This notation would follow you, influence future assignment decisions, create complications." Complications. A polite word for blacklist, for marking, for ensuring that whatever unit I rejoined would know I'd failed some unstated standard, that I'd proven myself unreliable, unsuitable, weak. The Imperial Guard didn't look kindly on soldiers who volunteered for duty and then declined to complete it. "Or," Krell 7 continued, "you could accept our offer. Continue serving the Imperium in a capacity suited to your demonstrated skills. The Emperor needs efficient instruments. You have proven yourself to be precisely that. Efficient instrument, weapon, tool, thing that kills without hesitation, without question, without the inconvenient burden of conscience or moral consideration. I'd become exactly what they'd trained me to become, and now they were offering me the opportunity to help create more things like me. I should have refused, should have accepted the complications, the notation in my record, whatever consequences came from saying no. But I was so tired, and the part of me that might have refused had gone quiet, and in that silence, Krell 7's offer sounded almost reasonable. "I'll do it," I said. And that was how I became a training officer for the Graviton Rifle program. How I spent the next 3 years teaching other volunteers to become efficient instruments. How I refined the techniques that made us most effective at turning armored targets into bags of compressed meat. How I developed the tactical doctrines that the Departamento Munitorum eventually approved for wider deployment. The Grav-Gun saw action across 17 sectors. The after-action reports lauded its effectiveness, high kill ratios, Minimal collateral damage to infrastructure, psychological impact on enemy forces who discovered what the weapon did to their casualties. The Mechanicus produced them in increasing numbers. The training facility on Mordax Tertius expanded, processed thousands of volunteers through the same conditioning I'd undergone. Most washed out. Some became operators. A few became like me, trainers, evaluators, the people who determined which volunteers had the necessary qualities to fire a weapon that crushed organs inside armor. I should tell you that it bothered me, that I lay awake at night thinking about the stronghold, about the child running between buildings, about every operator I trained and every target they killed with the techniques I taught them. That would make this confession meaningful, redemptive somehow, proof that some part of my humanity survived. But it didn't bother me. Or rather, it bothered me the way a chronic injury bothers you, a persistent ache you learn to ignore, to work around, to accept as the normal cost of existing. I trained operators, and they deployed, and they killed rebels and traitors and enemies of the Imperium, and I filed reports on their performance, and I recommended improvements to the weapons design, and I never once questioned whether any of this served some purpose beyond itself. The Grav-Gun is in widespread deployment now. Thousands of operators across hundreds of regiments, all trained, according to the doctrines I helped develop. The Departamento Munitorum considers it one of the most successful specialized weapons programs in recent Imperial history. There's even talk of integrating it into standard infantry loadouts, making it as common as las guns or autoguns, something every guardsman might carry. I should feel proud of that. I should feel like I've contributed to the Imperium's military effectiveness, served the Emperor's will, helped create something that makes his soldiers more lethal, more capable, more efficient. Instead, I feel nothing. And here's what I've learned. What 3 years of training operators has taught me. The graviton rifle doesn't crush your organs. Not directly. What it crushes is the part of you that would refuse to use it. The part that would see a child running and pull your finger off the trigger. The part that would question whether rebels deserve to be compressed into meat bags regardless of their crimes. The part that would ask whether efficiency is really a virtue when what you're being efficient at is killing people who look exactly like the person holding the weapon. The Grav-Gun is effective because it makes death clinical. Armor intact, body destroyed, no visible wounds, just targets that stop moving. You don't see them bleed out. Don't see them crawl away with their guts trailing. They just crumple, fold, compress, and then they're a casualty statistic rather than a person. It lets you kill without really confronting what killing means, and that's more effective than any weapon's destructive capacity. I've trained 847 operators. I know the number exactly because I track it, because some part of me needs to know how many people I've transformed into things like me. Most of them are still alive, still serving. A few have died in combat. More have requested transfers, broken down, developed the psychological complications that get you reassigned to non-combat duties. But most adapt, the way I adapted. They learn to hear the whump, whump, whump pulse without flinching. They learn to watch targets crumple without really seeing them. They learn to file reports without writing things like, "killed a child today," because the reports don't have categories for that kind of information. They learn to become efficient instruments. Sometimes I wonder if there's a version of me that refused Krell 7's offer, that accepted the complications, took the notation in his record, went back to the front line where at least the killing had context, had meaning, happened in service of objectives that made sense. I wonder if that version of me is alive, or if he died on some battlefield somewhere, or if he's somewhere thinking about a parallel version of himself who accepted an offer and became a thing that trains other things to use weapons that crush people from the inside. But that's just speculation. Philosophical waste. In reality, there's only this version, the one who said yes, who spent 3 years refining the art of compression, who taught 847 other people to look at human targets and see nothing but biomass requiring gravitational correction. This version doesn't sleep particularly well, but he sleeps. This version doesn't enjoy his work, but he performs it competently. This version has stopped asking questions about purpose or morality, or whether any of this actually serves the Emperor's will, because those questions don't have answers that would change anything. The facility processed its 1,000th graduate last month. There was a small ceremony. Krell 7 made a speech about efficiency and the Omnissiah's blessing and the future of Imperial military doctrine. The graduate was a kid, maybe 20, with eyes that still believed service meant something beyond just following orders. He thanked me for my training, said he was honored to carry on the program's traditions. I told him, the Emperor protects. That's what you say in these situations. That's what trainers are supposed to tell graduates. But what I thought was, the Graviton rifle doesn't just crush organs. It crushes the part of you that would care about crushing organs. It turns you into a weapon that's efficient precisely because it stopped being human enough to question efficiency. And the scariest part isn't that it does this to you. The scariest part is how easy it is to let it happen, how natural it feels to stop resisting, how reasonable it seems to just accept that you're a tool, and tools don't need to understand their purpose, they just need to function. That's what the Grav-Gun really does. It doesn't just kill targets. It kills whoever's holding it, piece by piece, crush by crush, wump by wump, until all that's left is something that can pull the trigger without hesitation and file the after-action report without really remembering what happened in between. And here I am, 3 years later, training more people to become what I became, refining the process, making it more efficient. Because that's what efficient instruments do. They optimize themselves. They improve their function. They serve their purpose without question or complaint. The Imperium needed efficient instruments. I became exactly what it needed. And if there's something wrong with that, some reason I should have resisted, some principle I should have held that would have made me refuse, well, that's been compressed too. Crushed into nothing. Reduced to gravitational statistics. The sound stays with me though. That wump 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 pulse. I hear it in quiet moments, between heartbeats, in the silence before sleep. The sound of gravitational anomalies forming, of armor compressing, of everything inside giving up and collapsing inward. It's the sound of efficiency. The sound of the Emperor's will made manifest. The sound of exactly what I volunteered to become. Wump. That's all there is. Really. That sound, and the silence it leaves behind, and the knowledge that tomorrow I'll teach someone else to make that sound, and they'll teach others, and the process will continue until everyone who needs to be compressed has been compressed, until the Imperium's enemies have all been reduced to gravitational statistics, until efficiency becomes the only virtue that matters. Wump, wump, wump. The sound of crushing. The sound of everything I am now. The only sound I hear anymore that feels true.